And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this AML, Unique AML Requirements for Prepaid Cards Knowledge Series session brought to you by TCAE. I am so excited to be with these two amazing female professionals. Anna Badour, the partner at the law firm of McCarthy, Tetrault, and Michelle Beyo, the CEO and founder of Finavator. These are two very passionate females, and we are in for a treat. They have a lot of information, knowledge, and insight to share with us today. So I hope you're all looking forward to this conversation, as am I. I will ask them both to introduce themselves a bit more and share a little bit more about the other projects, etc., that they're working on in a moment. But I just wanted to take an opportunity, since you're all here, to just share a little bit about my own journey with TCAE. As Suzanne kindly shared, I have been a mentor with TCAE. As many of you out there across the globe, I found myself last March in 2020 furloughed and looking for opportunities to network and learn and grow, and attended the first knowledge series session, and it's been nonstop since then. I think I've missed only a handful of sessions, and I saved every recording. It's part of my arsenal of training. I refer back to many of those sessions for insight and insider information that the speakers have shared, and I know I'm better off having the knowledge that's shared. It's not scripted, it's passionate, it's honest feedback from insiders and experts that know what they're talking about. So if it is your first time attending today, welcome. You haven't missed anything. You've arrived at the right time. The TCAE has opened up a membership program where you can access all of the previous recordings, and I can assure you, you're not going to regret it. It's safe for me to say that you're not likely to have access to all of these insiders and experts in any other forum than the knowledge series session. So, you can hear I'm so excited about this, that the TCAE knowledge series has brought a lot to myself and my own growth. I have been a mentor. I am a mentor with the TCAE for two of the certification programs, the CFCS and the CAMS programs. And of course, I thank Suzanne for those opportunities to share my own knowledge and learn a lot more from the professionals that are studying with us. And there's so many other programs that the TCAE offers. I just want you all to know that there's so much more than the knowledge series. So do check out the website and learn more as to how you can get involved. Again, I've made some career changes in the recent past based on some of the insight I've gained at these series, at these sessions, etc. And there's so many opportunities out there. So I welcome you to connect with the participants here, other people you see on the panel, and of course the TCAE insiders. I've just learned a lot, and I've grown so much in this last 1 year. I'm sure many of you can attest to that as well, that the TCAE brings us so many opportunities to connect and increase your own knowledge that it's so hard to pass up. So do connect with everyone you see here, and we'll move on to today's program. Anna, may I ask you to start? If you can just share a few words about yourself.
Sure, and delighted to be here today. I think this is really a testament to the passion that people have for AML and the strong community that we're seeing such a large group attend today, particularly given the timing on a Saturday. So certainly I want to thank everyone attending and express gratitude for you spending time with us. So in terms of background of myself, I am a partner at the Canadian law firm McCarthy Tetrault. I co-lead our fintech practice as well, and practice primarily in the area of financial regulation. Maybe to give kind of a bit of a human spin to it, I spent my first 10 years as a lawyer at McCarthy's doing more typical transactional work, primarily in the lending space. And then in 2013, I actually took a year off and did a master's in banking regulation, because in part I felt like there's a lot of theory happening behind what we were doing that I didn't necessarily have insight into why this was happening. So did a master's, and after that, essentially pivoted my focus more to regulatory, and found my master's in the US found that the fintech industry was really starting to happen there in 2013. You know, I had a prof, for example, that worked at a Bitcoin wallet, and just terminology was coming up in classes. I was very fintech focused, so that's really been a big area of focus. And in that area, we certainly see a lot of products, and we'll talk about this, that really leverage prepaid to essentially allow non-banks to compete in some ways with banks. So definitely an area that I am passionate about, and love being involved in, and happy to be here today. So I'll turn it to Michelle next to introduce herself.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. Really excited to be here as well. Being at this event in the morning, I'm always so impressed with how many people want to hear about AML in the morning on a Saturday. So I fully agree. Nelu, thank you for being our moderator, and Suzanne, thank you for bringing us here today, because I think it's such an important discussion. I don't think enough people know about prepaid and how it's powering innovation across many platforms. And I'm really excited to be here to share with you some knowledge. To give you a little bit of background, I actually did 20 years in the corporate space. I spent 6 years in the prepaid, in the telco space, and then did 8 years in online shopping affiliate marketing. I ran Alaska, Lufthansa, Delta, and United online shopping mall platforms, and then worked in the CIBC Bonus Reward Accelerator from a loyalty perspective, and helped Aeroplan launch their Shop Local program. So really passionate about consumer advocacy and having them have a lot of access, and ended up jumping into the prepaid space as running sales and marketing for a company called Incom, which is the largest prepaid company globally. They're in 30 different countries, and they run the gift card towers that you see at Walmart worldwide, 7-Eleven worldwide. And through that, in that role, I was able to launch a B2B division to create some very custom MasterCards that were white labeled for the incentive space, as well as help launch WeChat at 7-Eleven back in 2017, which got me very passionate about what fintech was doing in the world. And I ended up jumping into an Ivy program, which was the first Ivy program on digital currency, blockchain, and as well as cryptocurrencies. And it was just a really interesting course. It was an 80-hour pre-read and a 3-day course. And I was able to meet so many of the SVPs of the banks, and just got very passionate about what was the new vision of finance and how was it moving forward. And I jumped into a blockchain company as a chief client officer, where it was focused on data sharing for GDPR and open banking, with consent being on the blockchain. And after a year with them and experiencing crypto winter, as many of us did, I actually applied to Money 2020 Rise Up and was chosen as one of 30 women globally out of 500 to their program, and decided to launch my own fintech as that program was coming out. So Finavator was born in July of 2019, which was 2 years ago. And it's largely focused on payment innovation and helping banks and fintechs get there faster in North America, utilizing prepaid quite often actually to try and help them innovate. And as well as I sit on the board of the Open Banking Initiative of Canada, quite passionate about open banking, which you'll hear about later in this discussion. And I just got my first board seat on a VC called Ideal Ventures that is focused on investing in female-founded organizations. 20% of their portfolio is female, as well as ensuring that underrepresented immigrants within Canada also have the opportunity to have the capital they need to build unique organizations. So I'm so excited for this discussion and to hear a little bit more about what Anna is going to share with you in regards to specific regulations in regards to prepaid.
Great. So I think we can probably move to the next slide. Sorry, Neelio, I think I cut you off there.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. So maybe I'll dive in. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we'll talk really first about the prepaid product ecosystem. I think there's a lot of information that may not be transparent to people that are using these types of products as to how these products work. And we were definitely lucky to have Michelle with us today to help kind of walk us through that and kind of open up the hood on the prepaid product ecosystem. So we'll start with that for background. Then we'll talk about some of the AML risks relating to prepaid cards, some key terminology in the Canadian legislation, and talk about the AML requirements under the Canadian legislation with respect to prepaid payment products and prepaid payment product accounts, including on identification, record keeping, and other requirements. So maybe before I turn it quickly to Michelle, by way of background, and probably at least the Canadian folks on this call will be familiar with this. The legislation in Canada, the regulations in particular, have been amended to require AML or to essentially extend AML requirements to prepaid products as of June 1 this year. So this is definitely kind of new ground, but certainly an area where there are now kind of brand new requirements, which this is really what we'll be walking through today. So definitely an area where there's still a lot of questions probably unanswered, and still trying to figure it out as we go, but an area of focus, and definitely one where if these are products that you're dealing with in any way, you want to be familiar with. So I think we can probably move to the next slide and turn it to Michelle to give the background on the ecosystem. I think you've been muted, Michelle.
Thank you. Yes, I was muted. I'm not talking about open banking yet. You don't need to mute me. So to give you guys a little bit of background on prepaid, it's actually one of the rails, especially in Canada, with the lack of real-time rails and the lack of open banking. Prepaid has become the most innovative rail in the Canadian ecosystem, and many players are utilizing it. Some new stats that came out as well, that we've had a 21% growth in 2020, and that's largely due to the pandemic. Noticing obviously all of the digital growth that is happening in this new normal that we're living in. Prepaid has definitely flourished, especially with virtual prepaid taking a front seat, and all of the enablement that it is driving through challenger banks as well. So to give you some core stats, 4.9 billion is what was running through the prepaid rails in 2019. With a 21% growth perspective, we're way in the 5 billion range. And what that means from a growth perspective is just new ways to utilize prepaid for microloan infrastructure, for trust building to build credit, for insurance product aspects similar to AACare, if you haven't heard of it, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but ACH or healthcare spending accounts being put on prepaid cards, reward programs, personal finance management through kid apps like Treasure and many others that are here in Canada, and then peer-to-peer transfers, which are becoming even more important, are all powered largely by the prepaid infrastructure. There is over a third of all challenger banks are running fully on prepaid infrastructure. And when you look at what that's doing from a percentage growth, the GPR, the general purpose reloadable aspect, which are the Visa, MasterCard, Amex cards that are all subject to AML, are the ones that are seeing the large aspects of growth. And as we dig into the AML aspects of that, it's a consumer loaded card. Therefore, there's a lot of AML aspects that you need to be concerned with. And there's a lot of protection ratios. I think the thing that I learned when I came into prepaid in 2015, it had a really bad name in the market. in 2015. It was known for what fueled 9/11, was prepaid cards. And it has been over-regulated, in my opinion, for many years. But in that over-regulation, there was a lot of protection for the consumers, for the corporation, and there was a lot of visibility into the funds and how they're loaded and where they're loaded from a source of funds perspective. So it's a very secure methodology and rail from a payments perspective, and hence I think why it's being utilized so often. But from a consumer incentive perspective, there's a lot, the thing that hasn't happened yet in Canada is there's not a lot of B2B small business products. And that's what's starting to emerge. There's different regs on that, on KYB, and it gets a little complex. So hence why I think it's not as widely available just yet, but it powers so many aspects. Checks are going away. And people are utilizing prepaid cards to actually do disbursement payments, to do lottery payments, just because of its clarity and its ease of use, as well as for the end consumer, because it has a Visa, MasterCard, or Amex logo on it, it can be utilized anywhere. So if we go to the next slide, we could dig in a little bit more to who's involved in making a prepaid card. I think there's not a lot of knowledge in the whole process. It's not exactly easy, but it does allow non-banks to create a prepaid card that has a bank-like account. So it is fueling the challenger bank revolution around the world. So the cardholder doesn't know any aspects of what's happening here, but they are the consumer who doesn't need to know what's behind the curtain. What they need to know is to have a flexible, usable infrastructure that is going to give them all the services that they need. And prepaid is very much filling that gap right now. So to launch a prepaid card, what you need is usually a program manager. Many people try and be their own program manager. It is very costly. There are many program managers within Canada. Just to name a few is Berkeley, Incom, Marquetta. And what those program managers do is they have the APIs and relationships with everyone else you see on this page. And basically, as a new company, all you have to do is connect to a program manager and they will help you with all aspects to follow. They obviously take some revenue in that aspect, but it does make for a much quicker activation launch to your consumer. So definitely should be something you consider if you're launching in the marketplace. And then there's a service provider. So you very much need to do your due diligence, do your KYC and AML infrastructures as you identify your consumers or your KYB. You can use someone like Plaid or Flinks or Equifax or a combination. But this is an important step that you cannot get a prepaid card unless they have passed full compliance. And I always suggest that someone speaks to Anna or someone within the expertise within the Canadian marketplace before they launch to ensure that they're collecting the right information, holding it in the right way, because compliance, especially with this new reg, though it's coming in June 1st, it's not being, how do I describe this? They're giving a let until next April of people getting up to speed with these new requirements. So it's always really good to talk to a lawyer as you're building your AML strategy. And then an issuing processor. So there's many in Canada. A homegrown one is Carta out of Oakville, but Galileo is extremely well known out of all of their programs that they facilitate, as well as FIS. So there's a lot of different options, but everyone has advantages and challenges. And I think depending which product you're building, you would need to look into their offering, their APIs, and figure out which would be the best for your product set. And then the issuing bank in Canada, actually, it's largely been a monopoly for quite a long time. People's Group, People's Trust has a large majority of the entire market. I'm really happy to share that last year, Finavator, one of the first pieces of work that we did was we helped EQ Bank come into the prepaid space not only get a BIN to help the fintechs within Canada, but also to power their prepaid card, which they announced that they're launching as well. So it's really great to add more banks into this ecosystem, because BMO actually has their own prepaid card, but they don't extend their BIN to fintechs. Same to RBC, and many other players from the big banks who are in the prepaid space are just doing it for themselves for their one product. So it's really great to have players like EQ and People's and ATB and others, so that fintechs have an ability to build a product. And then from a payments network perspective, as I said, Visa, MasterCard, and Amex are the three options. Incom actually owns the rights to all Amex cards around the world from a prepaid perspective. So that's, if you needed Amex, you'd have to go to Incom. But if you wanted Visa or MasterCard, your program manager can help get you in touch with them and get access. You would want to choose different ones based on different reasons. I know many people who have a MasterCard in Canada and a Visa in the US as a company. And then, there's different combinations of how you would work with that. But once you've put all these players together, you create a prepaid card. And in that, the consumer cardholder goes to the merchant and uses it like an everyday credit card or debit card, whatever, actually very much like a debit card. Whatever they load onto it is what is accessible to them, and it works wherever Visa or MasterCard are accepted. So I hope that gives you guys some insight to the players in Canada as well as the flow. And as we go to the next slide, I'll just explain a couple.
Actually, maybe before we go to the next slide, Michelle, I think there's some concepts that probably are, very familiar to ourselves, but maybe not to others. You referred to a BIN. Do you want to explain that a bit more for people who may not be familiar with that concept?
Sure. So a BIN is something that you would be able to, you would have to, as a bank, as a Schedule I bank, you can get a BIN, a prepaid BIN, either for a consumer GPR or for a corporate BIN. They're very different. They have different regulations. They have different mandates on how you can utilize them and what you can utilize them for. But you can only get them if you're a Schedule I bank. And when you get this BIN, it's basically a range of MasterCard numbers or a range of Visa numbers. And what People's or EQ would do is they would have a BIN for consumers, and then they would be able to get a fintech in and give them a range of their BIN for that program. And then that fintech has, as many cards as they actually need within that range to utilize for those customers. But when people change from MasterCard to Visa, it's a big uplift. They have to change their 1-800 number, they have to change their card issuance, the printing of the card, and obviously they're completely switching BINs. So those BINs are creating a Visa or MasterCard, and then what happens is the fintech is creating an account of an app, usually that the customer goes in, like Coho, and when you open the Coho app, it looks like a bank account. It has all of your information, whatever money that you've loaded to it, and then it has all of your transactions that you've spent, as well as they have most of them saving buckets. You can move the money around so that you're having better management of your money. And it's all run on that BIN. It's not a bank account, but it is kind of being used as a pseudo bank account in its UX and UI customer experience perspective.
For sure. And related to that, there's what's known as a BIN sponsorship agreement that you enter into with the bank. And so that's, one of the key agreements when you're dealing with the prepaid card space that you enter into. So sorry to interrupt. I just thought that, BINs are natural for us to think about, but may not be to kind of newcomers to the space. So maybe I'll turn it back to you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. And I see that Joseph has put in there, there's different BIN ranges. And yes, if you have Amex is usually starting in 3.7. If you have Visa, it normally starts in a 4 and can have different ranges depending on which bank you're with. And from a people's perspective, it does range as well, but it does start with a 4. So I think that's good knowledge. It starts with a 5. So there you go. So it does depend from that perspective, and the big 5 all start with 4s.
Michelle, I was going to save the questions till the end, but there was just a comment here. Is there a role for a distributor in this ecosystem?
Yeah, so distributors usually play in, so if you go to a Walmart, let's say, there is Visa cards or MasterCards that are prepaid single load, meaning the $25 or $50 or $500 cards that you find at retail, they're usually run by Blackhawk or Incom. They're called My Vanilla or My Choice cards, and they're single-use cards. So a customer can go in, pick up at most a $500 card. It activates after you pay for it, and then you can go utilize it. Mostly people buy them to go shop online because they don't want to use their core credit card, or if they're going traveling, sometimes that's the same reason, or to give to their kids if they're shopping online from that perspective as well. But that's a distributor model where those cards are happening at retail. And then you could utilize it in a distributor model to some degree, but the thing is, the regulation is so specific that unless you are the issuer, like you are the company, like Coho, nobody's really distributing Coho, though they did go to Incom and had it at some retailers. So you could have picked up a Coho card and purchased it and activated it through retail from that perspective, if that helps answer the question.
So they exist, but outside of this model here, it's a separate function. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And as we jump to the next slide, you'll see a little bit more detail. The thing about prepaid is it's actually 2 different card infrastructures. It's not just the one we're talking about right now, which is the open loop prepaid cards, which are the ones that I spoke of that have the Visa, MasterCard, or Amex accompaniment of them being accepted everywhere. Then you have the closed loop cards, which are like your Uber card or your Uber Eats card, your Amazon card, or Gap card. Those are called closed loop because you'll purchase $50 with Gap, and then you can only utilize it at Gap. And they're regulated differently, meaning that they can never expire. That came into law, Anna will correct me if I'm wrong, but 2007, that gift cards could never expire a balance if they're closed loop. So they have different regulation. They're very consumer focused, and they cannot normally be reloadable on that front. They're usually single use prepaid cards, mostly picked up physically at a retailer, but with the pandemic, so many of them have turned to virtual. So there's companies like Yugo Wallet, which is actually owned by TD. And there's a lot of different infrastructures out there where you can go on, buy a gift card, buy a greeting card, and send a digital $50 gift to somebody anywhere in Canada. And that is having massive growth on that perspective. So that digital gifting experience is kind of changing the experience for consumers. And those are able to be added to your Apple wallet to be utilized as well. And it's becoming extremely convenient way to share. And I think when you look at the two, they're very different. Anna can give maybe a little bit more color on the regulation differentials, but when people speak of prepaid, they're normally right now speaking of the challenger bank GPR perspective.
Yeah, so maybe just to overlay the regulatory aspect. You know, we're speaking primarily today on the AML side, but there's also consumer protection laws that apply to these types of products, and that's provincial. So, you know, every province has its own, although they are vastly consistent. And generally, what they provide is that there's restrictions on fees, expiry dates, and their prescribed disclosure requirements. And in a number of provinces, although not quite all yet, a card that's issued by a regulated financial institution is essentially exempt, which really captures the open loop market. And so as a result, those requirements and limitations wouldn't apply. And in part, that's because there are some provisions under, for example, the Bank Act that would apply to a card issued by a bank. So there's no need for that duplication of regulation. So there is kind of a complex overlay of federal and provincial regulation here, but it's much more restricted for a closed loop gift card in terms of, from a consumer protection perspective, what can and can't be done. And to simplify that, essentially, you really can't charge any fees or have expiry dates on a closed loop gift card in the Canadian market.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. Thank you, Anna. And I think as we go to the next slide, to get a little bit more insight, go into the depths, like the in-depth flows of prepaid ecosystem and the flows of funds. I won't spend too much time on this, but the beneficiary or the card offer. So the card holder receives the funds by having paid or benefits directly deposited onto the issuing bank card, which is directly onto the card, to keep it simple. The card holder receives the card, activates it, and loads it, which allows them to have the card in their possession. The card is used at the merchant like everyday cards are, similar to debit, but with a Visa, MasterCard, Amex logo on it. The merchant processes the card, the transaction goes back to the processor. It routes the transaction to the bank identification number, just like any MasterCard or Visa. It's approved and the transaction is allowed to go through. And then the issuing bank settles with the brand, which is Visa or MasterCard, usually 24 hours later. So what that means for the apps, if you're on a Coho card, you're spending, those transactions are instantaneously approved at the retailer or online. There really isn't many restrictions other than country restrictions. So if you go to Revolut, who has been very widely known for being the card for travel, especially if you're in the UK, Visa and MasterCard do have some restricted countries where the card is not able to be utilized. And that is the same around the world. So any restricted country, the card will not work, but it works very similar to a Visa or MasterCard online or any retail acceptability from that front. So it is very simplistic. Once you build this whole product, and to Joseph's point, yes, you do need a card processor to create and print the card and ship it to the customer. And when the customer gets the card, they activate it, they select their 4-digit PIN, and once it is activated, then they can load the card, and not in advance of that activation perspective, because that's another validation point of the consumer is who the consumer says they are. From that perspective. The other thing, just to note, that if you are shipping a card to a customer, it cannot go to a PO box. It does have to go to an address that is the end customer. So that is an important point for GPR consumer loaded cards. No PO boxes, no secondary address perspective. It has to go to their home address. Anna, do you want to add anything to that?
No.
So I think that takes us through this slide, and we could pass on to the next one unless there's any questions, Nalu.
No, I think I'm good to go.
Wonderful. Over to Anna.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. I think that was really helpful. And I think, we are lucky to have Michelle walking us through that, because it's not something that is easy to figure out from the outside. And you really need kind of an insider's viewpoint to really grasp who all the parties in the ecosystem are. So thank you. So maybe turning next to, why are we talking about AML regulation of prepaid cards? What are the risks, and what's the driver behind the new regulation in Canada? And globally speaking, there has been a focus on prepaid cards as a type of product that has some AML risks associated with it, in part because it's the kind of product that can be used to move money quickly and to some extent anonymously. And in terms of the Canadian perspective specifically, when Canada was assessed by the Financial Action Task Force in 2016, the lack of regulation on prepaid cards was noted as a deficiency and one that should be remedied. And so that's been the real driver behind the new regulation in Canada. And it's timely because in 2016 they were a product that was used, but it was a much smaller market. And we didn't have, for example, the more sophisticated kind of fintech type products that we see today. So certainly, more and more these types of products have been very much akin to debit cards. So that's really the driver in terms of the regulation in this space. Some of the concerns as well have been expressed in terms of border crossings, and there have been at times considerations as to whether or not you need to declare these types of products, those types of things, because it can be easier, for example, to move a large amount of currency across the border by way of a prepaid card as opposed to physical cash. So certainly there are aspects of prepaid cards that do create some AML risk. That being said, in the Canadian market for banks, they were in many ways treating prepaid cards already as subject to AML regulations, in part due to some feedback from OSFI that really was pointing to the risks there. So we'll talk about the mechanics of the new regime. I think some of it is not necessarily new, practically speaking, although it is definitely kind of a new set of requirements to kind of grapple with. So I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so there is terminology that's under the regulations that really needs to be, understood so that you can see what it applies to. And the key terminology that we'll go through is a prepaid payment product and prepaid payment product account. So the prepaid payment product is really what is captured under the new regulations. And a few key things to point out here. It's something that's issued by a financial entity. So when we were going through the ecosystem and what the various players were, the fact that it's issued by a financial entity is one of the key aspects of a prepaid card from an AML regulation perspective. It's something that can be used to give access to funds or virtual currency, so it does capture virtual currency as well. The distinction with respect to prepaid versus other products, it's where you get access to funds that have been paid in advance of a transaction taking place. There are some exclusions, and most notably closed loop gift cards are excluded. So that's the second bullet there. Also excluding credit or debit accounts, which would be already captured for financial entity. And it excludes as well products that are issued for single use for a retail rebate program. We've talked about both reloadable and non-reloadable cards. They're both captured under this definition. It is really intended to be a very broad term. And when we were kind of walking through before, I think really the key distinction is the open loop versus closed loop. And this terminology is really intended to capture, all of the open loop type products out there in the Canadian market. We can turn to the next slide. So we also have this terminology of a prepaid payment product account. The word, the term account is really one that's used already in the legislation in a variety of ways, and it's kind of a familiar concept. So, although it seems a bit duplicative to have both the product and the account is kind of the more familiar type concept. And they're really, those types of accounts are those that are connected to that prepaid payment product that we talked about. But there are some thresholds here, which are really key. So it's either that there is the ability to add $1,000 or more within a 24-hour period, or the ability to maintain a balance of $1,000 or more. There are, again, some exclusions, and those are really quite particular to the prepaid space, because some of the use cases for prepaid either have to do with government benefits and the use of prepaid cards to flow those out, or charitable programs. So for example, first aid relief in case of emergencies, etc. So those are two exclusions to what's captured here under the prepaid payment product account, which is really, the key concept in terms of the requirements that we will be talking about that apply in the space. We can move to the next slide. Another concept that is really key and is one that doesn't really exist for other products, so it's one that is very particular to prepaid, is that of the authorized users. So when you're talking about other products like debit, you wouldn't have this concept of authorized users typically, because the account is in the name of the entity that has access to the account. For a prepaid card, the way some of the programs work is that they could be, you could have a prepaid card that has multiple authorized users, such as, for example, a prepaid card that's used in a corporate setting. So this concept is introduced here, this authorized users, and it's something else that is key, again, to understanding the requirements in the prepaid space from an AML perspective. So those are the key terms. So I think we can move to the next page in terms of the actual requirements. So the requirements on the AML side, at a high level, they're really what you're familiar with. They're identification, record keeping, reporting, ongoing requirements on the relationship, beneficial ownership, PEP and HIO requirements as well. So at a high level, they're things that you're familiar with. It's just the mechanics of it are a bit different because of the type of product. So we can move to the next page. Right. So identification. So I think that's where there's the most change in terms of, practically speaking, what does it mean to run these types of products, and where are the challenges, etc. And so first of all, before we dive into requirements a bit further, I did want to point out the requirements really sit with the financial entity. So when we were talking about all the different players in the ecosystem, at the end of the day, the entity that's regulated from a FinTrack perspective is the financial entity. That said, they do flow down the requirements to other parties by way of contract. Because at the end of the day, to some extent, the financial entity may be a bit more in the background and may need other parties to, for example, collect the identification documentation. But the entity that reports FinTrack on this and is responsible for this is the financial entity. And so it needs to identify the account holder, which makes sense, the authorized users, which is what we talked about before, as well as anyone making payments of $1,000 or more to the prepaid payment product account. So again, this is a bit different than you would see, for example, in a bank account, where you're really focused on the account holder. So it is broader, and practically speaking, when we're dealing with prepaid payment products, which have been typically available, off the shelf, for example, in stores, or available through online means, signing up through a fintech, for example, challenging to operationalize compared to typical banking products that are typically issued through, a branch or some other kind of physical location where you're capturing the information or through some other process where there's been an ability to verify that is kind of long-standing in use. So definitely, the good thing is, there's been some loosening in terms of ability to identify from an online perspective, because a lot of these products, at the end of the day, there is no, there's very little ability to do physical identification given the way that they're sold and used in the market.
Anna, there was a question from Joseph. Is the $1,000 limit 24-hour period or life?
For the financial, for this slide, I think it is, I think it's over, I don't think it's over life. It's either 24-hour period or single payments, but it's not a cumulative threshold.
And we have a whole bunch of questions.
Oh dear, okay. I haven't been able to do two things at once very well.
That's okay. Is the risk on the company or the person? And the risk is on the company. It's a company's due diligence that has to prevail. And just to share a little bit more about the relationship, the challenger bank or Coho or whoever's running the prepaid card has an agreement with the sponsor bank, program manager, and Visa and MasterCard. And they are responsible to uphold what the bank requirements are. And therefore the bank is responsible, but the company is liable. I think that's the right terminology.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just dive into some of those questions now rather than waiting to the end. So I'm just going to go back a little bit here because there were some. I think we may save some for the end though, because they weren't specific to the slides. So we have here. Okay, this is going back a little bit, but with respect to the initial slide, so where you had the blocks where it started off with the program manager. So I believe it was slide 2 after the agenda, just the second one after the agenda. Who is responsible for identification in that chain?
It's the actual company who's creating the card, but they have to uphold the identification to the issuing bank standard, which is largely the Canadian bank standard.
Yeah, so the financial entity is the one that reports to FinTrack on this, but it essentially contracts out those requirements to the entity that is the closest to the actual end customer. And so there is a contractual relationship and a flow down of responsibility. But if there were, for example, an examination or a fine, it would be with the financial entity that would sit.
Okay, so Jacqueline had asked if the risk was on the company or the person. So I may have to ask Jacqueline just to add some clarification as to which risk you were speaking to.
I think everything we've spoken about, the risk is on the company. The consumer is protected. So all responsibility lives with the company. And as we said, anything the company does has to be to the bank infrastructure and Visa or MasterCard or whoever they're with as well. So they have a lot of compliance to uphold, and many of them use Plaid or Flinks or a combination of different things to get them there, but they are ultimately liable if they do anything offside.
Would you say that the parties along that the journey in the ecosystem are adding additional layers of perhaps like due diligence or requirements, or are they all referring back to the bank, the issuing bank's requirements, initial requirements there?
So there's requirements from Visa or MasterCard. There's requirements from the bank. There's specs from the printing house, but from an AML compliance standpoint, many of them are from the issuing bank or from Visa, MasterCard.
Agree.
Perfect. Sort of it asked here, why would prepaid cards have set limits? Who determines these restrictions? Ideally, it is our own money in the bank that we are accessing. So is it done only to protect consumers in case of fraudulent activity? And then secondary to that, and every financial institution has different limits. There's no is there a standard limit as such?
So in terms of limits, it's really a risk decision in terms of, for example, they're really trying to deal with fraud risk on these types of products. There are dollar limits that are set, frankly, because of these thresholds that we're talking about on the AML side, and wanting to stay below those so you don't have, for example, to require identification, etc. So that's where these limits that you see on these types of products come from. At the end of the day, the bank is trying to limit its losses and its compliance requirements with these types of products. The reason you don't see them, in a banking context, is because that type of product is used, in a different way to some extent, and instead you would see their limits, for example, on transaction sizes, and for example, the ability to debit certain amounts on certain days, etc. So that's how the fraud risk is dealt with there. It's just a bit blunter, maybe, in the case of a prepaid product.
Yeah, and I could share some added insight. So because I ran all of the 100 retailers in Canada who sold prepaid through Incom, we trained the retailers to only sell 5 cards to any one person, and it's meant to be $500 limit that they're supposed to be buying at any one time for prepaid. So many of the cards at retail you'll see don't really go over 100. There is the anomaly that sometimes there is a Visa or MasterCard that ranges from 250 or sometimes 500, but there isn't a $1,000 card. Joseph just asked one question that I'd love the answer to as well. The regulation, do you have to check ID for everyone who loads over 1,000? If it's a GPR, obviously, but I don't know another situation where they could load 1,000. Is that somebody loading somebody else's account when you say anyone making a payment?
Yeah, so if someone's loading someone else's account, then yes, you would need to check their identity. And that's been one of the struggles from a implementation perspective for those, setting up some products in this space to try to figure out how to do that. And so as a result, what you see is people just put in thresholds where you never hit that $1,000. It's kind of the easy way around those types of new requirements.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to note that I put in the chat is many prepaid cards, the bin has been restricted to $10,000 lifetime balance on the card. And that's also for risk and compliance perspective. Some of them go to 20,000. I've seen some go to 99,000 back in the day. But many of the new ones, I would say the balance on prepaid cards are kind of maxed out at 10,000. Would you say that's the norm, Anna, that you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure.
We do have several more questions, but maybe we'll go ahead with the presentation. I think some of them are more in line with some of your later slides.
Sure. Okay. So I think we can move to the next slide. So, in this presentation, we really set out the various record keeping requirements that apply to prepaid. And I won't go into these into too much detail. We set them out here. They're clearly in the guidance. But there are some new record keeping requirements that do apply to this product. And maybe if we move to the next slide, I think really one that I did want to point out is this new concept of a prepaid payment product slip, which is a new record that you would need to keep for every payment that's made to the account that would capture certain aspects of information. So again, a new concept, and one that definitely has been a challenge for some in the space to operationalize. I think we can move to the next slide. Also, a number of record keeping requirements that apply that are transaction based. Dealing with, for example, foreign currency exchanges, or initiation of EFTs, etc., or transfers. So again, some record keeping requirements that are particular to prepaid that exist. Again, I won't go into these in detail. They're set out here in detail. Hopefully, this presentation is made available for those who find it helpful. But definitely a lot of record keeping requirements that have been introduced in this space.
How would you
So,
say the best way to handle those record keeping challenges? Have you found anybody who's found the best solution?
I think it continues to be a struggle. I think until all of the technology and infrastructure is caught up to these new requirements, it will continue to be challenging. I know FinTrack tried to socialize them, before them coming into place, so that system changes, et cetera, could be made to capture these. But I know that it's something that companies still struggle with, and is still kind of a challenging and in process kind of thing to do. Not sure, Michelle, if you've been hearing of the same.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I feel that that's why they've extended the deadline from
Mhm.
June 1st to April 2022.
Right.
But I still think based on some of these, it's going to be a challenge for some organizations.
Right. Agreed, for sure. And then I think we can move to the next slide. So on top of the particular, general or the particular requirements that we talked about on identification and record keeping, in general, and I mentioned this before, the requirements that would apply to accounts would still apply to these types of products as well. So typical reporting requirements, SDRs, et cetera, business relationship requirements, ongoing monitoring, beneficial ownership, and PEP requirements, including those extending those PEP requirements to the authorized users of the prepaid payment product accounts. There are exceptions for processing of payment, so just in terms of the merchant itself, but the requirements themselves do apply in many ways in a similar way that you would see for accounts generally. So I know there were quite a few questions in the chat, so maybe this makes sense to, at this point, turn to those and try to tackle those to the extent that we can.
Absolutely. So, one of these questions here we have were, could you please throw some light on the transaction monitoring rules to be adopted for monitoring the customer activity, as these rules will be slightly different from banking transaction monitoring rules? No.
I'm not sure what that question's getting at specifically.
I mean, secondary to this, a question I would ask is, since you're saying that the requirements are based on like the like the Visa or the MasterCard, etc., like, and then obviously the regulation that we're trying to comply with, who would be responsible for all, like, like in the event of an examination, etc.? Is it, I'm thinking it from a smaller, say, MSB or small FI perspective, you're going to go back to that business to be like, produce these records and demonstrate you the due diligence that's completed. I'm just looking at, Vishwanath's question here. Who would be responsible for monitoring the same activity? Like, is Visa monitoring every Visa cardholder activity?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, the financial entity is the one that's responsible for the monitoring. There is very limited monitoring from the credit card networks, although to be honest, I've mostly seen the credit card networks turn back to the financial entity and say, we've seen these transactions, confirm, are you monitoring this as the FI, and why haven't you flagged these? So again, it all sits with the financial entity. Again, it's awkward given this ecosystem that we're talking about and all the different players, but there is a flow back of all that information back to the financial entity, and they're supposed to have full transparency into all the transactions that are occurring, so that they can do the proper monitoring from their perspective.
And hence why you see not as many program managers extending out to fintechs, because all the responsibility and the brand all falls on the financial institutions. So they have to have a very tight regime very great compliance infrastructure, and really good relationships to share out the right information to the right parties.
Yeah, and Michelle mentioned, it's a bit of it has been a bit of a monopoly in this space traditionally, with People's Trust essentially being the primary issuer from a financial entity perspective. And so this is something they're very familiar with and have built processes around. And so it's not something that a random financial entity would start to just jump into without thinking through. It really requires specialized expertise from a compliance perspective.
Perfect. Bob asks here, the regulations deem a life insurance company to be a financial entity when it offers prepaid products to the public. Would you say this means the LI must be the issuer, or would it apply to a life insurance that is simply branding a card that is issued by an FI?
So
Yeah,
go
sorry,
Anna.
Oh,
No.
I was going to say, it's not meant to apply to a life insurer branding something by an FI. It's just that in this context, really, the life insurer is the FI in terms of offering the product. Michelle, certainly welcome your views as well.
Yeah, so they're not the financial institution, but they're liable from the issuing bank. So the issuing bank is the financial institution issuing the prepaid card, but they are liable as a party involved and their brand being attached to this card. So they have to abide by their issuer bank's compliance. And if they are not complying to it by not doing the right KYC or AML or any of those things, then they are liable because they're part of the chain, but they're not the issuing bank. So they're not the financial institution in my mind, but they still need to comply to all of the infrastructure.
Perhaps, Michelle, could you speak to what would be a use case for a life insurance company issuing these cards or branding cards?
So there's a company out there called AACare, and it's a new Canadian company. And what they're doing is healthcare spending accounts, which many insurance companies do. And these healthcare spending accounts are, you give your employees $500 on a prepaid MasterCard, and they can go spend it. And it's a RAN card, which is a restricted access MasterCard that only works at any certified practitioner within Canada. So then if they go to a massage therapist or they go to buy prescriptions, the card works. So many insurance companies are using companies like AACare and white labeling it. So therefore they have a prepaid card through someone else to give out these healthcare spending accounts. And if they do it in that manner, they're actually even farther proxy from the card because they have someone running the entire card infrastructure with an issuing bank behind it, but their brand is still on it. So they're still part of the value chain.
Okay. Wow, we have so many questions here. What are the record-keeping obligations for reloadable products with a limit and a 24-hour velocity below $1,000? Say for a product with a $100 reloadable limit, are there any record-keeping requirements?
So if you're below the thresholds, I don't believe there are any specific record-keeping requirements.
Okay. I mean, I suppose that does pose an issue because, I mean, say like traditional, business smurfing, you do small transactions below reporting thresholds, record-keeping thresholds to evade detection, but
it becomes very costly though, because every transaction has a cost to it. So,
absolutely.
but that might negate. But I think like if they're a loadable card that are loading at $500 or $999, there's no requirements, Anna, from a record keeping perspective, as long as they don't hit over that 1,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, there was an attempt to be practical here, that these types of products, yes, they create an AML risk, but they're also used for in some ways, pretty small transactions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a pretty kind of innocuous context of, and Michelle gave examples of, you want to shop online, or you give it to your kids as a way of giving an allowance, etc. And so there was definitely a lot of pushback initially on the idea of capturing prepaid cards within the regime, particularly, as I mentioned, given the way that they're sold in the market, which is, either, in a store that is not, at the end of the day, the issuer. It's not that you're not buying it at the financial entity or online. It's practically speaking difficult to operationalize a lot of this. So these are thresholds are really introduced to essentially not kill this market. So yes, there certainly are some risks that remain, but at the end of the day, you also have a product that, for all the risks that we've talked about, also is used in a very legitimate way, and if you're under those dollar thresholds, hopefully you're pretty low risk.
Yeah, and I think you see a lot of cards that say $500 load limit that was already in play because they were checking source of funds or some different aspects there. And many of these cards, you see people who are allocating $500 of their paycheck monthly to go to these Coho, Stack, Mogo cards, and that's their fun money. They don't want a credit card anymore, but they're going to push $500 of their paycheck over to these cards, and that's what they use for spending, restaurants and stuff like that. So they're very innocent on a large front, but that's really good to know that unless there's $1,000 push or more, then they hit all of these new rulings.
So speaking of the $1,000, Joseph had asked, are there requirements to check IDs then for every load of over $1,000?
For the load, yeah.
Okay, let's try to move here quickly. So from an AML perspective, there could be the possibility of illegitimate funds in the form of cash getting into the financial system through prepaid cards. Are there any controls in place to check this? I mean, I'm certain.
Cash can only really get in at retail. So like Canada Post is actually a location that allows you to load your prepaid cards, certain cards that they have within their program. That you can go and load there, but there's tons of restrictions. You have to present ID. You can't load the card, and Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, for more than I think $250. Depending on the program, maybe it goes up to 500, but I don't think programs can choose a number higher than 500 to load a cash into a prepaid card. And those programs that are utilized, there's only 5 of them that are approved and run by Canada Post for cash loading.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Michael has asked here, if a card is loaded and the funds are suspected to be the proceeds of crime, are there issues reversing a load from a regulatory perspective in Canada?
All Anna.
Well, you never want to touch the proceeds. You never want to touch funds that you think are proceeds of crime. So it's always very awkward when you're dealing with those types of funds. You would typically file an STR if you're finding that issue. You can reverse the transaction and essentially close out the card. That's one way to deal with it. Some parties freeze the funds and have various ways of dealing with that going forward, like approaching law enforcement, etc. So it would be kind of based on how the entity wants to deal with funds that they think are contaminated, and that can be very fact-based. There's sometimes where you may have a bit of a suspicion that it's proceeds of crime, and sometimes where you have certainty, and so you may have different processes that you follow in each case, but in some ways it's very similar to if you're seeing those types of funds come into a bank account.
Yeah, and Gallup, like any type of processor, has a lot of fraud functionality aspects built into their platforms. Some are stronger than others. I know Galileo has a very, very strong fraud infrastructure built into the process of any transaction running through their prepaid cards is flagged, monitored, and brought to the program manager, the bank, and the company to review. But Anna's answer is perfect in regards to crime dollars.
Perfect. Can prepaid cards like money orders be sold in sequential numbers? Is it so can prepaid cards be sold in sequential numbers? Is it possible that this should also help with the beneficiary and the originator? Um,
Mm.
I think this isn't speaking to the record keeping requirements.
But I think maybe,
Yeah.
Michelle, the first part of the question would be yours. I think they are sold in sequential numbers. Yeah.
They are, though when I was at Incom, we started to change that up, at least to cards being distributed to stores, and packaging was changed over time. So I think, yes, if you're doing GPR printing, but if you're going to different retailers, many of them have not sequential cards in the same rows. If that makes sense.
I'm going to just go quickly to a question. I know we're almost at time here, but some questions that came in advance. So, what are the AML requirements for prepaid cards issued to a business, for example, a gaming company, in turn issuing prize cards as a promotion to winners in the form of prepaid gift cards? Who's responsible for monitoring the transactions of these end customers, the gaming company or the cards issuer?
Yeah, it's an interesting program. So that is a B2B program. So it's a KYB scenario. So that the business is going to be KYB'd. And as long as the amount, and Anna will correct me if I'm wrong, isn't over $500 and they're not reloadable, then they don't have to be named on where they're going from an end user perspective. And the transaction use is just monitored by Visa and the processor. But it's the business that is being KYB'd because they're the one issuing these cards, and you will still need to know if it goes over 500, the person's first name, last name, date of birth, and I think that was the only information needed, up to 1,000, and then it goes into full KYC. But
Right.
That's 3 years old information. So Anna, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of that comes through from the credit card rules, et cetera. But at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, the financial entity is the one ultimately responsible, and then they pass through their requirements, including on the KYB side, in terms of what they internally are looking for.
Yeah, and I think when I was just leaving Incom in 2018 in January, KYB came out that if in lifetime or in a year, if you sold to a business more than 1,000, you would have to KYB them.
Based on the question, I'm assuming if it's a promotion, it is, smaller values, they, internal use only. Can open loop prepaid cards be issued as gift cards?
So I wasn't quite sure what that question was getting to. We talked about open loop versus closed loop, and I don't know if the question's getting at the underlying mechanics or the regulatory aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think if they're trying to issue it so that it doesn't expire, like you don't want to. The thing is like if the Visa MasterCard perspective, you could do a single load card and give it as a gift, but it's still going to have potential fees on it, and it's going to have an expiry date because it's a Visa MasterCard. So it can be given as a gift, but it's never going to be considered a closed loop, regulatory wise.
Yeah.
So we do have several other questions, but I think we've covered everything that was in the chat. And I think I'm just going to close up here with an open-ended question here, something kind of what I would like to know. I guess in time with the pandemic. So would you say that what, if any, effect has the pandemic had on the rate of development and adoption of these innovative financial products? You started off the presentation saying that there was that 21% increase in the use, and we're talking about in billions of dollars. Do you see that continuing? Is this just a transition in Canada and globally, or was that just a sign of the times because we were trying to avoid cash, we weren't meeting people, we were doing things online? What's in it? Like some predictions. What's happening for Canada and prepaid products? Where do you see
So
us going?
yeah, so I know that we're running out of time, so I always passionately like to talk about open banking. I foresee, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, the pandemic has changed us to move towards contactless digital payments, which is a phenomenal move. We've moved 10 years faster than we would have without the pandemic, and it has largely changed consumer behavior. You see people having to pay outside of a retailer, and therefore the retailer has to have a terminal that can go outside. And you also see consumers not wanting to touch the terminal. So contactless payments have become really important, and having chip-based cards in prepaid, which is a trend that was only happening in GPR and definitely continuing. So I think what you're seeing is prepaid, it definitely has a seat at the table. It's always, been growing, but I think this 21% growth is showing that the pandemic has definitely moved prepaid more into the forefront, and it's solving a lot of consumer issues. And it really is driving a lot of innovation. So I'm really passionate about prepaid and what its ability to help the underserved and underbanked, even though we only have maybe 4% in Canada in comparison to 35% in the US. Many of these 4% are in rural locations or new immigrants to Canada or students, and prepaid is their gateway into normal society, into being able to buy online without having to always go buy a prepaid card at retail, which was not always possible in the pandemic. So it's showing its importance. And with open banking, I'm very passionate that it needs to come to Canada, as though prepaid is doing a lot of innovation. Our real-time rail isn't scheduled till 2022, and it looks like it's delayed. We're the last in the Commonwealth to make any statement on moving open banking forward officially in Canada. We're so far behind the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, all of these countries who are modernizing their financial ecosystems to allow consumers to have their own data rights so that they can move their data from one company to the other on their own choice, as well as to have better access to more affordable products. And I believe it needs to come here for Canadian citizens to have the real value that other citizens around the world are having. And hopefully this community and others can push upon the government to really realize that with over 4 million people utilizing fintechs and prepaid to get access to better services, they deserve a better way than screen scraping to share their data.
Maybe I would add, not so much focused on open banking, but on prepaid. A lot of the most innovative products that we're seeing in the Canadian market are really leveraging prepaid. And I think initially that was as a result of essentially necessity of trying to figure out a way around requirements trying to figure out a way to not be a deposit taking institution, and trying to figure out a way to have access to the Canadian payment system without there being the real-time rail available yet, with the broader access to non-banks. And so we've seen as a result really interesting products in the prepaid space, and I'm now actually seeing it at the stage where more traditional, FIs are looking at prepaid and thinking like, how can we bring this into our space? And so it's spurred a lot of things. And so, from what initially was a pretty vanilla rail, right, a very kind of limited product. There's been so many additions of budgeting software and loans built on top of prepaid, et cetera, that it's really gathering the interest and attention both of consumers, but also other FIs that wouldn't have needed to use prepaid, but are seeing the most innovation there. So definitely a product where it's hard to predict what it will look like in 5 years as it continues to expand and grow, but it's definitely a space that is growing very quickly and is quite exciting in terms of products.
Fantastic. Well, I know I speak for everybody here in attendance that we all enjoy this informative session, and I think we probably have many more unanswered questions. So I echo Suzanne's comments. You both do need to come back here and speak to this further. And I encourage everyone to follow both Anna and Michelle to see where they're taking open banking and regulation in the prepaid space further. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful Saturday, and we welcome you to the next TCAE session in 2 weeks.
Thank you so
Thanks
much. It was great being here.
Thank you.